The hammer slammed down on the auction block. The crowd jeered as the woman stumbled forward, weak, shaking, clutching a newborn to her chest. Sarah Whitman, only 3 days a mother, had been dragged from her home and thrown into chains when her husband couldn't pay his debts. Now she and her baby were being sold like livestock to the highest bidder. She braced for the leering hands of men who laughed at her tears. But one man didn't laugh. Jonah Briggs, a rancher known for kindness and solitude, stepped through the crowd, laid down every coin he had, and said calmly, "I'll take them both." The auction yard fell silent. Nobody expected a hero that day. But life on the frontier had a way of surprising even the cruelest hearts. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wagon wheels creaked over the rutted trail as dusk spread its bruised light across the plains, painting the sky in long, bleeding streaks of orange and purple. Sarah clutched the bundle against her chest, the baby's soft breaths warm through the thin blanket, and watched the back of Jonah Briggs as he guided the horses in silence. His shoulders were broad, his hat pulled low, and though his face stayed turned away, there was something careful in the way he held the reins, as if he were afraid that one wrong tug might break more than just the horse's rhythm. The road wound through dry hills and skeletal trees, and with every jolt of the wagon, Sarah's body reminded her of the birth that had nearly taken her life 3 nights before. Her wrists still bore the marks of rope, her mind still echoed with the auctioneer's voice calling her price. Jonah said nothing when she flinched at every sound, and that silence cut sharper than cruelty because it left her guessing what kind of man had bought her freedom. When they reached the ranch, the house rose from the valley like a ghost-weathered wood, lantern light flickering through the window, a thin column of smoke curling from the chimney. He climbed down first, boots crunching in the dirt, then offered his hand. She hesitated but took it, the roughness of his palm startling her. It was the touch of a man who built his life from stone and sweat, not the kind who hurt for sport. Inside, the air smelled of pine soap and coffee grounds. He showed her a small room at the end of the hall, clean sheets on a narrow bed, a cradle already waiting beside it. "Rest," he said quietly. "You're safe here." Then he left, closing the door as gently as if afraid of waking her child. But safety was a word Sarah had learned not to trust. She stood there, clutching her baby tighter, listening to the wind scrape against the window panes. Outside, she heard Jonah's footsteps fade into the barn, the soft whinny of horses, the rhythm of chores done without hurry. No chains, no shouting, just the steady life of a man alone on the frontier. She sank onto the bed, exhaustion pulling her down like a tide, but even as her eyes closed, she couldn't stop waiting for the sound of a lock turning. When morning came, light spilled across the floorboards, and the smell of frying bacon drifted under the door. She rose slowly, every muscle aching, and when she stepped into the kitchen, Jonah was there, sleeves rolled, hat on the table, moving with quiet purpose. He glanced up once, nodded, then slid a plate toward her. "You can stay until you figure what comes next," he said. His voice held no demand, no ownership, just a statement as plain as the land itself. Sarah wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what kind of man bought a stranger only to give her freedom, but the words caught in her throat. For now, she just ate, the warmth of the food chasing away a cold she'd carried too long. The night was heavy with wind, pressing against the house like an animal trying to claw its way inside, and Jonah lay half awake, staring at the ceiling beams when the sound reached him, a sharp, desperate cry that cut through the dark like a knife. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his concern, that the woman and her baby had been through worse than a little cold. But the wailing grew, thin and frantic, and before he knew it, he was throwing on his coat and boots, lighting a lamp, and heading down the hall. The fire in the stove had burned low, the air biting with the chill of approaching winter. And through the half-open door of the spare room he saw her Sarah rocking her newborn, her face pale with exhaustion and panic. The baby's tiny fists flailed in the air, its cries tearing at the quiet like thunder in a church. Jonah hesitated in the doorway, his hat in his hand, uncertain whether his presence would help or harm, but instinct pushed him forward. "He's hungry," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she wanted his voice. She didn't answer, only looked up with those wary eyes, still half expecting him to show the cruelty the world had already promised her. Jonah disappeared to the kitchen and returned with a tin cup of warmed milk, steam rising in the lamplight. He set it on the table, then added an armful of split wood to the hearth. The fire flared, painting the room in golden shadow. And for a moment, Sarah just watched him, this tall, quiet man with hands built for labor but moving with a gentleness she'd forgotten men possessed. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled between gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Jonah paused, staring into the fire as if the flames might answer for him. "Because it's cold," he said simply. "And he's just a baby." There was no pity in his tone, no hint of pride, just truth, bare as the land outside. Sarah didn't know what to say. The world had taken everything, from her husband to her home, and kindness now felt like a trick too cruel to trust. But when Jonah crouched to adjust the cradle and the baby's cries softened, she saw how he looked at the child not as a burden, not as something bought or owed, but as a fragile life that deserved warmth. The wind howled outside, shaking the shutters, yet the room felt softer somehow, the fire's crackle steadying the silence between them. Sarah's eyes burned, tears slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. "He's not used to quiet nights," she whispered. "Neither am I," Jonah replied, his gaze distant, as if haunted by his own ghosts. For a while, neither spoke. The baby sighed, the storm eased, and Jonah stood, nodding once before heading for the door. "If you need more wood, it's by the stove," he said. Sarah wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat, so she only nodded. When he was gone, she looked at the cradle, at the tiny chest rising and falling, and for the first time since the auction, she felt something close to safety. By the time the first thaw of spring softened the ground, the story had already grown legs and teeth by then. Every ranch hand, drifter, and drunk within 20 miles knew that Jonah Briggs had come back from the auction with more than cattle feed. At the saloon in town, men laughed into their whiskey glasses, slapping each other's backs as they traded versions of the tale, how old Jonah had finally bought himself company, how the baby was proof he couldn't do better, how pity could make a fool out of even the most decent man. Jonah, for his part, said nothing. He rode into town once a week for supplies, tipping his hat to the clerk, paying in full, and riding out again before the gossip could stick to him. But Sarah didn't have the luxury of silence. The first time she went into the general store alone, the air went cold the moment she crossed the threshold. Mrs. Halpern behind the counter gave her a look that mixed curiosity with judgment, while a pair of men near the shelves smirked loud enough for her to hear. "That's her, ain't it?" One whispered, not nearly soft enough. "Briggs's charity case. Guess a man'll take what he can get." The words struck like stones, casual, cruel, and thrown for sport. Sarah kept her eyes on the shelf of flour sacks, forcing her trembling hands to stay steady as she reached for one, but her knuckles whitened against the fabric. She wanted to believe she didn't care, that their words couldn't touch her now that she was free. But humiliation had a way of slipping under the skin, finding every wound that hadn't healed. When she brought the items to the counter, Mrs. Halpern cleared her throat and said, "Jonah's a good man. You'd best not make trouble for him." Sarah blinked, unsure whether it was warning or pity. "I'm not here for trouble," she said quietly. "Just flour." The bell above the door jingled, and sunlight fell across the floorboards. Jonah stepped in, tall as ever, with that same unreadable calm that made people stop talking the second they saw him. He nodded to her, then to the clerk, setting down a coil of rope and a tin of coffee. The room fell silent, but the air buzzed with unspoken laughter. "Heard you been busy playing family man, Briggs," one of the men drawled from the back. Jonah didn't turn. He paid for the goods, picked up the sack of flour from beside Sarah's basket, and said evenly, "You boys got a strange way of calling kindness foolish." His tone wasn't sharp, but it carried weight enough to quiet the room. Then he looked at Sarah and said, "Let's go." Outside, the sun was blinding, the wind sharp with dust. She walked beside him in silence, the shame still coiled tight in her chest, until he finally said, "You can't let their talk own you. Folks out here don't know what mercy looks like, so they mock it." She met his eyes then, seeing not pity but understanding, and something steadier resolve. For the first time, she believed maybe he didn't buy her out of charity. Maybe he just couldn't stand to see someone broken when he knew how it felt himself. The morning began like any other. the kind of quiet that made Sarah believe for a fleeting moment that peace might last. The light spilled soft through the kitchen window, painting golden streaks across the floor as she kneaded dough with steady, practiced hands, the baby cooing from the cradle nearby. But the calm shattered when hoofbeats thundered up the drive hard, hurried, carrying the weight of something grim. Jonah stepped out before the knock could sound, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression tightening when he saw the sheriff's horse lathered in sweat. Sheriff Dawes swung down, hat in hand, his weathered face drawn into lines of apology. "Jonah," he said, voice low, "we got trouble." Sarah froze, flour dusting her hands, her heart already racing with a fear she didn't yet understand. Jonah motioned for her to stay inside, but she couldn't help listening through the open door. The sheriff shifted, glancing toward her before speaking. "It's about her husband. Turns out he owed a heap more than anyone thought, gambling debts. Real bad men out of Kansas City. They came through town asking questions. Said the woman and the child were theirs now, part of what was owed." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The rolling pin slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Her breath came short and fast, the walls seeming to close in. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, but the sheriff's eyes told her it wasn't a lie. "They called her property, Jonah," Dawes went on quietly. "Said they'll be coming for her. I figured you should know before they do." Jonah's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek as he looked past the sheriff toward the open plain stretching endless and empty, where danger could ride up from any horizon. "How many?" he asked. "3 that I saw," Dawes replied. "Mean sort. Won't care about law once they're here." Jonah nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then they won't leave breathing." The sheriff sighed, replacing his hat. "Don't make this worse than it already is, Jonah. Just be careful." When he rode off, the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale as ash, tears already burning her eyes. "They'll kill us," she whispered. "They'll take him from me like they took everything else." Jonah crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and set his hands on her shoulders, steady, grounding, unyielding. "Listen to me," he said, voice rough but calm. "No one will touch you while I'm breathing." His gaze locked with hers, the kind of look that didn't ask for belief but commanded it. Sarah wanted to protest, to tell him he didn't understand what men like that could do, but something in his tone, something cold, forged from years of surviving his own losses, made her believe him despite the terror clawing at her chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like a warning. Jonah turned toward the barn, already moving with purpose, checking the rifle slung by the door, counting rounds, measuring distance in his mind. Sarah watched him, torn between fear and awe. She realized then that Jonah Briggs wasn't a man who sought violence, but one who knew it too well, and if those men came, they'd find the quiet rancher wasn't the easy mark they expected. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both began to need. The kind that made time slip by unnoticed beneath the endless stretch of prairie sky. Sarah refused to sit idle after the sheriff's warning. Fear had made her restless, and work was the only thing that steadied her hands and quieted her thoughts. She rose before dawn, stoking the fire while Jonah tended to the horses, and by the time the first light crept over the hills, the scent of biscuits and coffee already filled the cabin. She patched his shirts with careful stitches, scrubbed the floor until it gleamed, and followed him out to the corrals where the cattle bawled and the wind carried the smell of dust and sage. At first, Jonah tried to stop her, told her she didn't owe him a thing, but she only gave him that stubborn look that reminded him of the mountains, unmovable, quietly fierce. "I can't just sit and wait for trouble," she said one morning, hands on her hips as the baby gurgled from the sling on her chest. "You gave us a home, let me help keep it." He'd nodded then, not because he agreed, but because something about her conviction left no room for argument. Slowly, the house began to feel less like his and more like theirs. He caught himself listening for her voice when he came back from the fields, the sound of her humming some half-remembered lullaby as she rocked the child. And though he told himself it was just the company he'd missed, there were moments, small, quiet ones, when he'd catch her smiling at the baby and feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The boy grew stronger, his cheeks round and pink, his eyes bright as new pennies. Jonah built a cradle of oak from leftover lumber, carving a little star into the headboard just because it made the child giggle. Sarah noticed, of course. And when she thanked him, her voice caught the way it did when she wasn't used to kindness. One evening, as the sun sank and the fields turned gold, Jonah sat sharpening his knife on the porch while Sarah hung laundry, the baby lying on a blanket beside her, kicking his small legs at the drifting dust motes. Then, out of nowhere, the baby let out a bubbling laugh, clear, bright, and alive in a way that made both adults freeze. Sarah's hands stilled on the clothespin, her eyes wide, and Jonah looked up, the knife forgotten in his grasp. The sound came again, lighter this time, like bells in summer air. Jonah chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if he'd just seen a miracle he didn't believe he deserved. Sarah knelt and scooped the child up, her own laughter spilling free, the sound mingling with the wind. For the first time in months, there was no fear, no sorrow, only the fragile, staggering wonder of life going on. Jonah watched them against the burnished light, his chest tightening with something he didn't yet have a name for. In that moment, with the baby's laughter echoing off the hills, it felt as though the world had paused just long enough to breathe again. The night was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every creak of the floorboards sound like thunder. The fire in the hearth had burned down to faint red coals, and outside, the wind dragged across the plains in low, mournful sighs. Jonah lay awake, the instinctive kind of restlessness that only comes when danger is near, his hand resting on the rifle propped by the wall. Then came the sound, faint at first, a scuff of movement beyond the window, too heavy for wind, too deliberate for chance. He sat up, muscles coiled tight, eyes fixed on the sliver of darkness where the curtain didn't quite meet. Another sound followed the soft jingle of tack, the faint snort of a horse. He was on his feet in an instant, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who'd done this before. Sarah stirred as he pulled on his coat, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" Jonah's tone was calm. Too calm. "Stay with the baby. Don't light the lamp." He stepped into the cold, the door clicking shut behind him. The night air bit hard, his breath misting in the moonlight as he crossed the yard, boots crunching in the frost. The barn loomed ahead, black and hulking, the wind tugging at its loose boards. He crouched low, the rifle steady against his shoulder, and studied the shadows shifting near the fence line. Nothing moved now, just the slow groan of the windmill turning. But when he circled the barn, the truth was there in the dirt. Fresh hoofprints, deep and erratic, leading in from the ridge and stopping short by the corral. Whoever they were, they'd been close enough to see the lantern glow through the cabin windows. Jonah knelt, tracing one print with his calloused hand. The edges were sharp, no more than an hour old. He stood and looked toward the horizon, where a pale line of clouds masked the moon, and he knew they were out there watching, waiting for their moment. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, the baby in her arms, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the rifle by the door, took off his hat, and knelt beside her. "They've been close," he said finally. "But they won't get any closer." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, memories of chains and jeering voices flickering behind them. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Men like that don't stop." Jonah reached out, his rough hand closing gently around hers. "Then they'll have to go through me," he said, steady and absolute. "You and that boy, no one will ever drag you away again. Not while I'm breathing." Something in his tone made her believe it, even as fear clung to the air like smoke. He rose, checked the rifle once more, and stood by the window until dawn. The first streaks of light catching the edge of his unshaven jaw, the look in his eyes carved from steel and promise. Outside, the hoofprints faded with the frost, but the threat hung over the ranch like a storm waiting to break. The morning broke too still, too clean, the kind of silence that only comes before something shatters. Jonah had been out near the corral, checking the fence line with one wary eye on the horizon, when the first echo of hooves rolled through the valley like distant thunder. He froze, the hammer in his hand mid-swing, and looked toward the ridge where 3 riders crested the rise, dark silhouettes against the bleeding dawn. He knew them before he could see their faces, knew the way men carried themselves when they came to take what wasn't theirs. "Sarah," he shouted. his voice cutting through the cold air. "Get inside now." She appeared in the doorway, the baby in her arms, fear already flickering in her eyes. "Jonah?" But he didn't answer, only grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the fence post and ducked behind the wagon. The outlaws rode hard, guns drawn, their laughter sharp and mean. "Briggs!" one of them hollered, voice echoing off the barn walls. "We've come for the woman. Don't make us kill you for what's ours." Jonah's reply was a single shot, the crack tearing through the morning stillness. One of the riders yelped and tumbled from his horse, clutching his leg. The others spurred forward, bullets whining through the air, splintering the fence posts around him. Jonah moved quick, loading and firing, his shoulder burning from the recoil. The barn door flew open, a horse screaming as lead struck near its flank. He saw Sarah duck low inside the cabin, clutching the baby, her pale face flashing between the curtains. Then one bullet found him slamming into his shoulder, spinning him backward into the dirt. The pain was blinding, hot and deep, but through the haze he saw one of the men dismounting, creeping toward the cabin with a knife glinting in the light. Jonah gritted his teeth, blood soaking through his shirt, and dragged himself up against the wagon wheel. "You'll never touch them," he growled, lifting the rifle with trembling hands. He fired again, the shot slamming into the outlaw's chest, dropping him before he could take another step. The last man turned, rage twisting his face, raising his pistol to finish Jonah. Then another shot cracked, but it wasn't his. Sheriff Dawes rode into the yard with 2 deputies, rifles blazing, the thunder of hooves and gunfire filling the air. The outlaw's hat flew from his head as a bullet grazed him. He stumbled, dropped his weapon, and threw his hands up as the sheriff's men surrounded him. "You're done," Dawes barked, yanking him to the ground. The gunfire died, leaving only the wind and the ragged sound of Jonah's breathing. Sarah rushed from the cabin, the baby wailing in her arms, her dress streaked with dust and tears. She fell to her knees beside him, pressing her hand against the wound. "Jonah, please, stay with me." He tried to smile, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Told you. No one would touch you." His voice was faint, each word soaked in pain. Dawes crouched beside them, grim and urgent. "We've got a doctor coming. Just hold on, Briggs." Jonah's eyes fluttered, the edges of his world dimming. He felt Sarah's hand trembling against his cheek, the baby's cry somewhere far away, like an echo from another life. Then, as the sheriff's men hauled the outlaws away, the ranch fell quiet again, except for the steady rhythm of a heartbeat refusing to stop. The days blurred together after the gunfight, stitched from moments of pain, care, and the fragile miracle of Jonah's breathing. The doctor had left by the second night, muttering that the bullet had missed his lung by God's grace alone, but the infection would be the real battle. Sarah took up the vigil without being asked, moving through the cabin with quiet purpose, washing blood from his shirt, changing the bandages, spooning broth past his lips when he was too weak to lift his head. The baby slept in the cradle by the fire, the small crackle of flame the only sound besides Jonah's ragged breaths. She spoke softly to him through the nights, not because she thought he could always hear, but because her voice anchored her to something beyond fear. She told him about her husband, the man who gambled their life away, who couldn't bear the weight of the debts he made. She confessed how she'd hated herself for surviving when everything else was lost, how she'd stopped believing any man could look at her and not see shame. Sometimes she'd catch him half awake, his eyes opening just enough to meet hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them like the quietest form of mercy. As the wound began to heal, color returned to his face, though the pain still haunted his movements. One evening, after a long stretch of silence, Jonah stirred, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You should rest," he murmured, seeing her slumped in the chair beside the bed. "You've done enough." Sarah blinked back exhaustion, shaking her head. "Don't tell me what's enough, Jonah Briggs. You nearly died for us. The least I can do is keep you alive." A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Guess I can't argue with that." The fire popped softly, casting a warm golden light over the rough cabin walls, and for a while neither spoke. Then Sarah set down the rag and looked at him, her voice trembling though her words were steady. "No one's ever treated me the way you have," she said. "You didn't have to buy me. You didn't have to protect me. But you did, and not once did you make me feel like I was less. Her throat tightened, tears threatening but held back by pride. I don't know how to thank you for that. Jonah's eyes softened, the shadow of pain giving way to something deeper. He reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm despite the weakness still in them. You don't owe me thanks, he whispered. You're not a burden, Sarah. You're a blessing. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and real, like something neither dared to name. For a moment, all she could do was stare, her heart hammering in her chest, the truth of it sinking in deeper than she wanted to admit. Then, slowly, she smiled, a small, hesitant curve of the lips that carried both disbelief and hope. The baby stirred, sighing in his sleep, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell held them. Sarah brushed Jonah's hair back from his forehead, her cheeks flushed with warmth she couldn't hide. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally come home. By the time the wildflowers began pushing through the thawed earth, Jonah's strength had returned, though the scar on his shoulder ached whenever the weather turned. The ranch, once marked by silence and survival, now thrummed with the quiet rhythms of something softer, something that felt suspiciously like peace. Jonah spent his mornings repairing the fence line, his afternoons mending what the winter and bullets had broken, and in the evenings he found himself carving wood by the hearth while Sarah hummed lullabies to the baby beside him. Each curl of shaven oak fell into the firelight as his hands worked with patient care, the cradle taking shape beneath his fingers not out of duty, but devotion. When it was done, he sanded the edges smooth and set it near the fireplace where the warmth would reach the child's tiny hands. Sarah watched from the table, her eyes shining in the golden glow, the smell of stew thick in the air. It's beautiful, she said softly. Jonah turned the cradle once, making sure it sat level, then looked up at her with a sheepish kind of pride. Figured the boy deserved better than a box and a blanket. She laughed lightly, the sound filling the cabin the way sunlight fills an empty field. The baby reached toward Jonah when he leaned closer, a tiny fist clutching the air until Jonah extended one rough finger. The boy gripped it tight, and Jonah felt something in his chest tighten in response, a fierce, bewildering tenderness he'd never known he was capable of. That night, after the dishes were done and the fire burned low, Jonah stood by the mantel, hat in hand, the quiet between them thicker than usual. Sarah, he began, his voice low but sure. You don't owe me anything. I need you to know that. If you ever want to go back east, anywhere, I'll help you get there. She looked up from where she sat beside the cradle, the baby sleeping soundly in her arms, confusion flickering across her face. Why are you saying this? He hesitated, then took a slow breath, the words dragging up from somewhere deep. Because I don't want you here out of gratitude. I want you here because you choose it. Because you want to. His gaze met hers, steady and vulnerable all at once. Sarah, I'd like you to stay. Not because I bought you, or rescued you, or any of that. Just because I want you. Both of you. The fire cracked softly in the silence that followed, its glow reflecting in her tear-bright eyes. She rose, crossing the small room in 3 quiet steps, and reached for his hand. Her fingers slipped into his, small and certain, grounding him in a way that felt like promise. Jonah, she whispered, you don't have to ask me to stay. She glanced at the sleeping child, then back at him, her smile trembling through the emotion tightening her voice. We already are a family. Jonah's breath caught, the weight of her words settling into the hollow places he'd carried for years. For the first time since the war, since loss and loneliness had carved him hollow, he felt whole again. Outside, the wind hummed through the plains like a hymn, and inside, 3 lives once broken, once bound by circumstance, had quietly become one. Summer came early that year, painting the fields in gold and wild sage, the air sweet with the scent of grass after rain. The ranch that had once stood as a lonely outpost against the endless prairie now breathed with life tools neatly hung in the shed, a garden fenced with care, and flowers Sarah planted blooming in old tin pails by the door. The sound of laughter drifted across the yard most mornings, carried on the wind with the cry of hawks and the low murmur of cattle. Neighbors riding past often slowed their horses just to take in the sight. Jonah Briggs, the man once known for silence and solitude, now standing by the fence post with a baby perched on his hip and a woman beside him smiling in the sunlight. Folks in town had stopped whispering about the auction wife long ago. Now they nodded respectfully when Sarah came by the store, her head held high, her basket filled with bread and soap instead of fear. The saloon men who once joked about Jonah's foolish kindness didn't laugh anymore. They'd seen him stare down death and build something better from it. Sheriff Dawes sometimes rode out just to visit, saying he liked the coffee, though Sarah suspected he came for the peace that seemed to settle over the place like a blessing. Jonah worked harder than ever, mending fences, breaking colts, and teaching Sarah how to handle the lasso when the calves got ornery. She proved quick and fearless, her laughter bright when he teased her for throwing better than half the cowhands in the county. And every night, when the chores were done and the stars spread wide across the heavens, they'd sit on the porch together, the baby asleep in the cradle Jonah had built, watching the world turn quiet and kind for once. He'd reach for her hand sometimes, rough fingers tracing the life he still couldn't believe he'd been given. There were scars between them, his from battles and bullets, hers from heartbreak and survival, but they'd stopped hiding them. They'd learned that love didn't erase the past. It simply made room for it to rest. Word traveled beyond the valley, as stories tend to do, of the rancher who'd bought a woman's freedom and found his own in the bargain. Travelers passing through would ask about the place with the blue door and the woman who always waved from the garden, and someone would always answer, "That's the Briggs place, the ranch of second chances." On Sundays, Jonah would carry the boy to the fence line and show him the world stretching out wide and wild, his voice soft as he said, "This land is yours now, yours and your mama's." Sarah would stand behind him, her eyes full of the same horizon that had once frightened her, and whisper a prayer of gratitude for the man who'd turned her chains into roots. And as the sun sank low, washing the ranch in amber light, Jonah Briggs would look at his family and know, with a certainty that reached clear to his soul, that salvation wasn't something you earned, it was something you shared.